With the top.
Okay, thank you. So, good morning, evening, afternoon. I want to talk about what I call cognitive workbenches, and it's still a work in progress, and I'd love to get feedback, but I think it fits in with the theme of this conference. Basically, what you see on the screen is what I want to have in people's minds. Okay, and the top two pictures you can see workbenches where people sit down and work on something, and in the bottom two pictures you see assembly lines, manual or robotic, it doesn't really matter. We have some product and it moves along from one place to another until it's ready. So what inspired me was a section written by Venkatesh Rao called On Thinking Caps. And he was describing what goes on in his head when he is thinking about something. And when I read the description, I realized that it's all floating around in his head. It's not tied down to anything in particular. And I was wondering, what does it look like when it is tied down? When you have these steps of assembling and disassembling sorts, throwing useless and used up sorts out. What does it look like? And how do we know what's happening in people's minds? So here's an example of a complex decision algorithm, which you're supposed to be able to do in your head, but obviously nobody does it in their head, they only do it on paper or using a computer. And you have step one, and then you make a decision and you evaluate, and step two and step three and step four. And obviously you get lost very, very quickly. So in our modern world, and that's what the subject of the conference is, we have tools which help us do it, whether it's a piece of paper or a computer or perhaps even some artificial intelligence assistant, which gives us information, reminds us where we are, and so on. But it would be really nice if it actually happened inside our heads. Why? Because the minute you take what's in your head and put it on a piece of paper, it's slower. It's like taking, cycles from the CPU and putting the memory on a hard disk and then reading it back on the hard disk. So I'd like to give you an example. Let's say you had this great idea. We'll make playmates for robots. Now, of course, it exists, but we'll make robot playmates for your dogs. Okay? It's a great idea. People have done it before. You don't know that yet, of course. So if you want to raise money, you have to build a business plan. Now, are you going to build the plan in your head, take long walks and think about what will my business plan look like? Maybe you'll talk to people about it and tell people, here's my plan, what do you think? And the question is, will you have a detailed plan or will it just be a vague conception? And here's a few examples of questions which usually when people have an idea and they're thinking about it, they don't actually answer. What are you going to develop in-house? What are you going to buy? Who are you going to buy it from? Who exactly are you going to sell it to? These are questions that have to be answered when you have a business plan. Well, luckily for us, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the business model canvas. This problem has been clarified for us. Developed this wonderful business model canvas. If you fill in all of these squares, you basically have a business plan, or at least a plan which explains how your business model is supposed to work. And it's wonderful. You can show it to people, you can discuss it with people. But I think the most important feature of this business model canvas is the following. Even if you don't fill it in, it already made the problem solvable. Okay, the mere presence of the structure of this form. Okay, so we have this form. The fact that we divided up the problem into these parts made it manageable. Now, what does that mean, manageable? We can just think about one of these squares at a time, like key partners or value propositions. We can talk to people. So this is definitely one of those tools that we had in one of the flash talks talking about tools that have been with us for thousands of years. This is a new tool, but it really helps you deal with your business plan. Now, what I want you to notice, why do I call this a tool and not just some sort of procedure? Because this is task specific. It's not content specific. In other words, if your great startup idea was selling rocks on Mars, you would use exactly the same canvas to analyze that problem. So let me pause for a second and say, why am I bringing this up now? This concept. Well, most work that we do today is knowledge work, and it's mostly abstract. And it's not really tied to any real object. Imagine a mechanic fixing your car. A mechanic, in fact, fixed my car just a few days ago. So he took the motor out and he took it apart. And he looked at each part separately. He had an actual physical object to help him keep it in mind. Now think about a programmer trying to design the architecture of a piece of software. He could write it down, but if he doesn't write it down, it's all abstract. So we want to build tools to help augment the abilities of these knowledge workers. So here's a question. Is it easier to build a tool if we know how the mind of the user is arranged? In other words, if we have to build a tool that is suitable for every single user and we have no idea what's going on inside their mind, it's kind of difficult to build a tool. But if we know that everybody's mind is working the same way, it's much easier for us to augment these functionalities. And then I ask the next question. What is easier? To extract the structure, in other words, to learn what each person who has a mind, how he arranges the thoughts, or do we want to impose some type of thinking upon it? And remember, we want to do it on the mind, not on some tool that the person is using in their hand. I call that tool a cognitive workbench. Now, there's a similar tool, which again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, a memory palace. Those who aren't, briefly, the idea is that in order to remember a lot of unrelated facts, you take a memory which you're familiar with, like the layout of your house, the walk you take to the park every day, and then you attach different facts to different places along that path. And of course, this works wonderfully, and the Greeks were using it, and we're still using it today. So let's look at the business model canvas using the same lens. So I took each one of the sections in the business model canvas and I attached a picture to it which represents perhaps my story. So key partners, you have a bedroom, key activities, you have a gym, key resources, you have a closet. So now when you go on a long walk in the countryside and you're thinking about your business plan, you can ask yourself, what do I have in the closet? What resources do I have in my closet? What do I have flowing in my canal? What about the cubicles? So this is a known tool, memory palaces, but let's take it one step further. If you look closely at the business model canvas, inside each square, it doesn't only have statements like who are my key partners, he also has questions like how do we find them? Which key activities do they do? The reason that's important is that instead of just arranging facts in your memory so you can spew them out again later, you're actually arranging activities at different locations. So in the closet, we have resources and we look for them and we decide how we're going to do quality assurance. In the bedroom where we have the key partners, we ask ourselves, how will we know if somebody's a key partner or not? And I want to suggest another power-up. Let's call it workstations. When you work in a factory, and I showed you the assembly lines before, a product goes from one step to the next and then the next step. And when it happens in our mind, we have to be able to put something down and then pick it up again later when we're ready. So imagine we have a box which we call potential partners. Now, mind you, this is all in your mind. You're thinking about the business plan for the robotic dog pal, and you're on a hike with your dog, and you're thinking to yourself, who could be good partners? And you have a list of 5 people, and you put them in that room. And then one by one, you move them to the next box, which is called vetting, where you have all sorts of activities for vetting them, like maybe you'll call them up, maybe you'll think about them. Then you can move them to the next box, which could be key partners or failed partners. Now, obviously, if you have a software system, it could reflect exactly the systems that I'm showing. But imagine how much easier it is to build the software system if we know and if we've trained entrepreneur to use this systematic way of analyzing data and moving it from one place to another. So if what I've just described can actually be done, we have workbenches, which are particular stations where you take an item and do something with it. And we also have some sort of assembly line, which allows you to take an item, do something to it, move it to the next station, do something else to it until you have a complete solution. Let me give you an example. A lot of people think by analogy. So I can have an analogy workbench in my mind. And maybe the analogy I'm trying to analyze is love is war, or life is a journey, or brain is a computer. So imagine at that workbench, I have tools. So one tool is map. We take parts of the analogy and parts of the object that it's supposed to be like, we match them up, and then we pin them down so they won't move. Then we have a tool called focus, where we look at the parts that don't match up so easily, and we wonder if we made a mistake or maybe we have to think more. Then we have other tools like trim and ignore, and finally a tool called apply, where you take the A and the B and you push them together and you learn something new. Now, all of this, of course, is happening in your mind, but instead of some general idea of, well, we have an analogy, we can have a clear process which other people can follow and can teach us. I also believe, and I'm reminding you these are still unfinished thoughts, this could be very useful for experts. Experts often have the problem that whatever they do is so intuitive that most activities are subconscious. So they might forget to do something. So you can have a checkbox saying, did I do all of the boxes? You can have a big picture function. You can imagine what's the entire, let's say, business model canvas, what it looks like when it's filled in. When you do that, it's very easy for you to tell other people what you want to talk about. If you are familiar or remember, the business model canvas has a very important function of communication. You show it to your potential investors, you show it to potential co-founders, you explain to them what's happening, they tell you where there's missing information. All of these details are easy if you're arranging your thoughts using this preset format. So this is, let's call it stage 1, but there's a higher level as well. When you have a physical workshop, you often have multiple workstations. You know, one for finishing, one for painting, one for cutting down to size. And you always have the problem, which one should you use? And the answer is you should have more than one workstation. Most people I've spoken to have not been able to identify any workstation that they have. Rather, when they come up against the problem, they apply some sort of standard set of solutions to solve that problem. And if you have a workbench, you have a selection of workbenches, it allows you to choose which one you want to apply. So I suggest that you have multiple workbenches and you choose between them according to the particular problems that you have. If you have a metalworking problem, you go to a metal workstation, and if you have a carpentry problem, you go to a woodworking station. So how do you do that? The answer is you have a meta framework, which again can have exactly the same format. We're very familiar with a lot of these forms. You have a form, you have empty spaces, you have to decide where you are. In this case, I'm giving you the example of the Kunefin, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, framework, which is supposed to help you decide if the situation you're facing is simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic. Now, what's very interesting about this framework is not just the titles that I gave it, but more interesting, underneath each title, there's a list of activities you're supposed to do if you are inside that part of the framework. In other words, if you're in the complex world, you should first probe, then sense, then respond. And if you're in the simple world, you should first sense, then categorize, then respond. In other words, depending on where you are in the world, you have to choose what actions to apply. There's more correct actions and less correct actions. So, all of these things that I've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, what properties do they have? One, they give you some sort of format to break down the problem into manageable parts. They have mnemonics that help you remember the parts, so that when you stop working on the problem, go to sleep, go do something else, wake up, pick up the problem again, you can remember where you were and what you did and what you didn't do. They have fixed algorithms that are like tools that tell you what you should be doing, perhaps at each stage. They have a mechanism to help you decide what to do. After a while, you don't even need to have it on a piece of paper because you remember the format. And in fact, the original memory palace was called the method of Loki, wasn't an actual 2D form. Instead, it was a narrative of a journey from one place to another. So it doesn't actually have to be imagined as a piece of paper. So I hope some of this was interesting to you, but if it was, I would like to hear any thoughts you have about any of the following 3 questions. The first question is, how do paper forms like the business model canvas help with cognitive tasks? The second question is, I don't know if you can give examples for different types of tasks. What's easier, filling out a form, just looking at the form and doing it all in your head, or using a memorized form? And the last question is, when you use a framework, do you feel that your framework is personalized, or you're using a standard framework that you learned in school or some mentor taught you? So if anybody has Any comments, suggestions, please? Not all at once, though. Okay, I'll ask a different question. Does any one of you, when you apply a mental framework to solve the problem, do you have something like what I've described as a cognitive workbench, or do you all solve the problem floating in your head?
Usually it's floating in your head.
Okay.
I guess it's hard to figure out, or if you don't have a meta framework like what you're saying, then it's hard to know which tool to use when you haven't classified the problem of, yeah.
That's my experience too. Anybody? So you always use the same questions? So what do you do with the answers? Um, I want to talk for a second about the business model canvas because I was around before it existed and now that it does exist. And one of the big things that it did was it used to be that you told an entrepreneur to prepare a business plan and they would not know what to do. And they would prepare some sort of set of slides similar to what they copied from somebody else, which wasn't any good either. And what they did here, strategizer, Tim Ulwick, I think, he took these standard questions that he would ask and he arranged them in such a way that now it was formalized. So I guess the question I'm asking is, do you feel that your work would benefit if you took these standard questions that you said, that you apply, and arranged them in some sort of canvas format? So that you could see that you applied them and saw them and used them properly. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.